Hey everyone, how you doing? So we're operating a bit late this week, unfortunately. So Stephen has now sent me his full notes, and I've uploaded those to the website. So you should see those actually just above the video that I'm posting here. And I will mention as a note that the reason I have a Monday evening deadline for the presentations is that in a seminar like this, I do like to get the discussion going in the week that we're actually, that the texts are actually part of our reading. So generally, I don't like to leave things quite this late. The other thing is that I could have tried to post something myself earlier on, but then it would be me doing what I did last week when we didn't have a presenter and just talking about the material itself. And I would rather, in general, respond to the presentation that has been made. So if you could try and make sure to have your work up. It doesn't have to be in video form. You know. It's great if you can, because that gives us a sense of maybe immediacy and also a sense that we're actually in a dialogue. But there's nothing in the syllabus that requires that you upload a video. If you want to start a discussion group and just simply use text, that's fine too. You're not going to be penalized or something like that if you don't upload a video. If you can do it, great. I think it would be great if we can actually meet each other and have a little bit more immediacy like that. So anyway, all of that said, let's get into the material itself. So this week we're moving into the 20th century, or maybe the spiritual 20th century. I mean, Nietzsche dies in 1900. He stops writing in basically 1889 because he was found in the streets of, I think it was Basel, kissing a horse. And there, after that, simply his mental state declined. He was still writing, sending letters all over Europe as the Ubermensch, but it was pretty crazy stuff after that. And so he was confined to an asylum after that and died in 1900. Heidegger, of course, is a 20th century figure, very much influenced by Nietzsche, along with a number of others. Our interest, and the text that I've given you here, are some pretty important texts. The Nietzsche text is from Beyond Good and Evil, which is, if you've ever encountered Nietzsche before, it's very possible that you would have encountered this book. It's often taught at various levels, and it's a very kind of clear and coherent, or at least as clear and coherent as Nietzsche gets, a presentation of his work. The thing about Nietzsche that you have to remember is that he's often regarded as one of the two great stylists, language stylists of the German language in the last couple of hundred years, the other being Goethe. Nietzsche was really brilliant at making language do what he wanted it to do. And that meant for him, using a lot of different literary techniques, tropes, positions, taking on characterizations of himself, personas, all of these sorts of things. And so what that means is that, as philosophers, we often look for a clear argument of some sort, somebody laying out an argument with premises and conclusions and so forth. Nietzsche, you don't read him that way at all. I mean, he's really, he's really trying to hit us in every possible way that he can. So we have to read him as much as a literary figure, I suppose, as anything else. And the reason I say that is that I'm sure many of you picked up on what he has to say, for example, about women in this in Beyond Good and Evil. And if you started off the book itself, the first thing you would read by him in the preface is, supposing truth to be a woman, then what? Is the suspicion not well founded that all philosophers, when they have been dogmatists, have had little understanding of women? So in a certain sense, that sets the tone for him. Looks like what he's saying about women is pretty dismissive, and it is. What you have to weigh against that is the fact that there are a number of very important feminists who find Nietzsche to be a really kind of invigorating and important figure. Why is that? Well, in part it's because of this kind of literary nature that he has. we have to ask ourselves, is he literally talking about male-female relations or the status of women in society or something like that, or is he doing something else with those images? I mean, he's constantly using, for example, religion and science and other things to talk about something more than what they are, I suppose, or talk about a kind of attitude that we have towards them or something like that. Is he against religion? He certainly looks that way in a lot of his work, and yet he's the guy who actually likes Jesus, right? He doesn't like Paul, he likes Jesus. He's the guy who likes the Jews, even though at some points, it sounds pretty anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, but the fact is he likes the Jews. He's not so crazy about the priests, okay? He likes Socrates. He's not crazy about Plato, right? So here's a guy who is not exactly falling into the nice categories, I think, that we sometimes, expect from our philosophers. Now, let's get to the material itself and to what Stephen had to say about the material in particular. Stephen raised a number of points about Nietzsche, and he raised, the issues of his, issues of gender and all of that sort of thing. He asks whether Ayn Rand and Nietzsche would have dated. I think clearly the answer is no, but it's actually, in a certain sense, an interesting question, because someone like Ayn Rand is clearly an individualist of a particular kind of sort. I mean, she really ultimately thinks that we ought to live for ourselves. And Nietzsche's an individualist without question, but the question is he that kind of individualist? I mean, is he the kind of individualist which says, me first, and everyone else after that? The world ought to revolve around me. I would argue, no, he is not really actually saying that. I mean, he is sometimes called a relativist. He's really what we might term a perspectivist or perspectivalist. In other words, he's trying to tell us that we ought to not be looking for some external validation or external, kind of corroboration of our ways of living. This is why he seems to come across as very against religion, because he thinks that as soon as you say there is something out there that governs you, then you've taken away the significance of your own actions. You don't have to own up to them. You don't have to own them at all, because now the question is, do they match up to an external standard, or don't they? The same is true, by the way, of science or progress. I mean, if you look at the chapters that precede our chapter in Beyond Good and Evil, 2 chapters previous, he gives the natural history of morals. And really, throughout that, he really takes a run at science and the way that science has tried to come up with a science of morals. In other words, figure out what it is, especially since the Enlightenment, that grounds our morality. So is it grounded in conscience, or is it, what is it grounded in exactly? And so, the kind of Enlightenment pretense is that if we can only figure that out, just as we, in science we figure out, what the kind of fundamental, starting points are. If only we can figure that out for morals, we will have not only the proper and true moral life, we will also have the building blocks for a proper and true social order. And so that notion is very common when Nietzsche's writing, and he hates it. I mean, he just really has no use for it at all. He thinks that that's not where morality comes from. Remember before I told you he likes Jesus, he doesn't like he doesn't like Paul. He likes the Jews, he doesn't like the priests. Well, why is that? Because he sees the Jews and he sees Jesus as living affirmatively. He sees them not as living without law or without standards, or just kind of anarchically or something like that. That's not what he thinks at all. What he thinks is that they were able to be the basis for their own approach to their own morality. Now, does that mean that they just made it up themselves? No, not particularly. No. It means that they were able to live affirmatively and live creatively. I mean, remember what Jesus says, right? The Pharisees challenge Jesus. They say, you're not really keeping the laws. Jesus says, I'm keeping the spirit of the laws. You guys are the ones that are not keeping the laws, right? Because you think that the laws are embodied in kind of, a slavish interpretation or a slavish adherence to some kind of practices. No, I'm trying to get at what the law really means, which is living creatively and living affirmatively. That's how we should live. That's what the basis of true ethics actually should be. So the same thing about the Jews versus the priests, right? I mean, the Jews are the ones, Nietzsche says, who are, originally made a version of God, which was the apotheosis of their creative spirit. That God was the one who truly embodied what it meant to be Jewish in all its joy and all of its vitality and all of its creativity and all of that sort of thing. What do the priests do? They come along and they try and package that. They try and put it in a nice little box and market it to everyone else and say that everyone has to live this way. And that just totally destroys that vitality and that creativity. So what Nietzsche's talking about is not this kind of, crazy, just make something up and live by it, or impose your will on the world, become a dictator or something like that. I mean, that's, yeah, he likes Napoleon, but he also likes Jesus, who was hardly a dictator. He likes the Jews, who were hardly, so you're getting a sense of this guy who is trying to get at a kind of inner force for morality. And in that, I would say, in a certain sense, we could see him not that far from someone like Aristotle, actually. I mean, you could take Aristotle as somebody who's giving us a kind of calculus for morality, or you could see Aristotle as being somebody who is trying to get us to the point of living ethically on a moment-by-moment basis. What does it mean to live properly, live well, by making our decisions moment by moment and grounding them in our own sense of who we are, rather than in some external sort of, determining calculus. So that's a version of Nietzsche that I think is way more interesting than the kind of usual version you get, in existentialism class or something like that. It's a version of Nietzsche that is, it puts a kind of valuation first, and I'm going to get back to some of Stephen's comments in a moment. But if you think about it, if you think about our connections between knowledge, epistemology, ethics, and social philosophy, in a certain sense, for Nietzsche, if we understand ethics as to be this version of valuation that I've just talked about, then everything else comes after that. If we can figure out what it means to live creatively and live well, and get rid of all of those kind of packaging mechanisms, those efforts that people have made to, make some kind of almost marketable version of our ethics that can be passed down and could be imposed on other people and all of those sorts of things. If we can get away from that, then we've got something interesting, and then everything else follows from that. So that's Nietzsche of Beyond Good and Evil. And so, you have to, in a certain sense, read him, through that kind of lens, I think. I mean, remember, he is the one who, as he says in another place, philosophizes with a hammer. He's hammering away at us. He's just trying to needle us to, because he knows that just a standard argument is going to fall into the history of other standard arguments, and it's not going to have very much force. And he wants to go a level below that. Or above that, if you wish, or whatever. So, Stephen's comments, I think, are useful, and he points out that there's a version of subjectivism and individualism at work in Nietzsche. It's true, as long as we understand that properly, not as relativism, not as caprice or anarchy or something like that, but as a kind of, creative affirmation of life. That's what he's really after. So if that's the case, then we've got, it makes a certain amount of sense, and I think Stephen picks up on some of that. Nietzsche takes a run at, as Stephen says, the moral sophists. Absolutely, the people who think that morality is just a matter of, arguing over, the rightness of an action, or figuring out just some little, kind of calculus on, is this the right thing or is that the right thing to do? All of the kind of theories of the right that we see in the modern era, and Nietzsche just has no use for that, and so Stephen picked up on that, and that's great. Stephen talks a little bit about, the question, should we be proud of our accomplishments? Yes, but not to the point of being boastful. I think sometimes that gets a bit overplayed with Nietzsche. this sense that, he's advocating that we are, these world historical figures, like Napoleon, who, stride across the earth and are the world changers and all of that sort of thing. I mean, if you look at Nietzsche, the world that he really thinks should be changed is our world, is our sense of ourselves. And people will be attracted to that. I mean, that's the message of Jesus for him, I think. Jesus was the person he was, and people were just attracted to it. He didn't set out to take over the world or something like that in Nietzsche's view. He didn't set out to set up a religion, and from Nietzsche's point of view, he just set out to live affirmatively and creatively and live joyfully, and it attracted people, So, that's I think, the version of Nietzsche that I think makes more sense. We can get into the details of Nietzsche. We can get into the transvaluation of all values, eternal return of the same, all of those sorts of things. Most of those don't come up in our reading, though. So, but I think there are ways of fitting all of that kind of stuff together through a lens of the chapter that we have here. So, that's a few of the comments on Nietzsche. Let's go over to Heidegger for a moment. And the reason I'm looking past you here is that I got my screen right behind the camera here, and so I'm just scrolling through Stephen's comments on the screen here, so that I can remind myself of what he said. Okay, so Heidegger, in this totally broken down version of Question Concerning Technology, the essay "The Age of the World Picture" is included, and that's the one that I've asked you to read. So what do we do with Heidegger? Well, Heidegger he found Nietzsche very inspiring. I mean, I think he got that sense of joyful affirmation, but he also had a certain problem with the kind of individualistic aspect that Nietzsche was trying to, ground his system in. I mean, ultimately for Nietzsche, this is an individualist decision. You have to decide for yourself. You cannot take seriously the world of other people's concerns or something like that. Heidegger is coming from a different point on all of this. He thinks that we find ourselves in a world that is already meaningful. It's a world in which we were born not in and just decide for ourselves what how we should live or something like that. We live in a world where there's already meaningful structures, meaningful action, all of those sorts of things. So the Age of the World Picture. Let me make a couple of comments on that, and then go on to what Stephen has talked about here. So the world picture for Heidegger, think of it. It could have been translated as a worldview or approach to the world or something like that. That probably wouldn't have quite done justice to what Heidegger's trying to say with this. For Heidegger, there is a sense that he wants to distinguish or differentiate between a certain way of coming up with that picture, a certain way of coming up with the contents of our mind that makes sense out of the world, and an almost Nietzschean ability to respond and react to a world. And so as you read this, you would have seen that he starts off talking about science, in a particular form, not scientia, not Aristotle's notion of scientia, but rather science as research, right? Now, if you recall, a couple of weeks ago, I put up a little thing on the course website about monks wondering how many teeth there are in the mouth of a horse, and a young monk comes along and says, "Well, why don't we just look?" And they flew upon him and smote him and threw him out and declared that he had been taken over by the devil. And then at the end of the day, they decided that, there was no way that we could know how many teeth there are in the mouth of a horse. And then so they wrote it down and they went off from there. And this sounds totally outrageous from our point of view, right? So, but it's a great illustration of the distinction, I suppose, between an Aristotelian version of scientia and a modern view of science as research, okay? So why wouldn't they accept the young monk's notion that you go and look? Well, because that is not giving you permanent knowledge. That is giving you a knowledge that may only apply to the horse that's right in front of you, right? But it may not apply. It may, it may have nothing to do with any other horse. This horse could have lost teeth or have extra ones or something like that. And so our response to that would be, well, let's look at more horses. Let's look at a whole bunch of horses and average out or figure out, what the most common, what the mean is, what the median is on teeth in horses' mouths, something like that, and that's how we would know. Not going to work for Aristotle, right? Because that had nothing to do with any knowledge that stems from the true nature of horses, what it means to be a horse. I mean, from the monk's point of view, what they want is first to figure out what it means to be a horse, ontologically, metaphysically, however you want to put it, and then what we can deduce from that. Okay, so there's certain things we can deduce from the true nature of something. If we humans are rational animals, for example, well, we can start deducing what does it mean to be rational. What does it mean for the operations of the mind, our behavior, all of those sorts of things. These can be things that have to do with the true nature of what it means to be human, and they're not the kind of things that are particularly accessible to empirical investigation. They stem from our true nature. Now, is the question of the number of teeth in a human's mouth or a horse's mouth or anyone else's mouth, is that the kind of thing that's going to be deducible from our true nature? Probably not. Right? I mean, it's hard to imagine how you could get that from that kind of lofty notion that, humans are rational animals or horses. I'm not even sure how Aristotle would define a horse, but however you would define a horse, it would stem from what he calls the genus and differentia style definition. In other words, what is the genus to which a horse belongs? Let's say mammals. And what is the differential? And what makes it different from everything else in that genus? Okay, so once you get a definition like that, you're getting at the true nature of something, and then you deduce from there. So that's Aristotle's scientia. Okay, from which and that's obviously a Latin word for it. So there is, or certainly used within a Latin context within the Middle Ages, and so. What we have here is a very different approach to what we have in the modern era towards how you generate knowledge. And it's important to know this. It's important to remember this because if we're in a course on knowledge, responsibility, and society, that's a pretty big divide on what counts as true knowledge, right? In the modern era, if what counts as true knowledge is something that is not absolutely certain, in other words, not deducible from some other, notion of certainty, well, we've got a very different approach then to what counts as knowledge. Now, back to Heidegger. He says, we live in an age governed by science. What does science mean? Science means research. Okay. What does research mean? Investigating, in German, what's called Gegenstand, which is the German word for objects. But in German, it actually works a little bit better because Gegenstand means standing against, standing outside of, or standing apart from. And, so what we think of as object is just a thing, we have a bunch of objects in the world and we might think of ourselves as objects, but in German, Gegenstand is the thing that stands against us, that is not us. So it's very much the kind of objective-subjective kind of split. And so for Heidegger, when he's talking about the world picture, he's talking about the picture as given to us by science, in which there's a world of Gegenstands, a world of objects out there, okay? And so we have to investigate those as things that do not involve us, as things that we're not implicated in any way. And this, and he doesn't say it in this work, but he says in a different work, he distinguishes between what he calls the correct and the true, okay? So we can find correct knowledge doing things that way. Can we find truth? Heidegger doesn't think so. We're not getting at truth doing that. We're getting at correctness. So I can say there's, a cup on my desk, or there's a book on my desk, or something like that. So that's correct. That's a correct statement, okay? But it doesn't get at truth because it doesn't get at our meaningful place in the world and our relationship to it. In other words, we've severed that. We've severed that question by talking about the world as if it was a world of objects, all right? And what Heidegger's interested in is getting back to the question of a world in which we too are involved, in which it's already meaningful, but we also build that meaning, and that it's not just a kind of discrete group of objects that can be manipulated out there. I mean, he thinks that in that world we are susceptible to a notion of technology, in which technology is just a kind of tool which we use to shape the world into whatever it is that we want the world to be. All right, so we can turn the world into a place that produces electrical power for us. Let's say, uses this example elsewhere, the dam that dams the river up, and from that we get electrical power. Well, what have we done? We've created what he calls standing reserve. We've turned that river, which is a material living thing that humans have to deal with as a thing in the world, or as a part of their environment, and we've turned that into a kind of abstraction, which is electrical power, right? Could come out of any socket, could have come from the river, could have come from nuclear power, could have come from wind or solar or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It could have come, it doesn't matter where it came from. It all comes out of our electrical sockets in exactly the same form. And so it's a kind of plastic abstraction. And we start thinking about the world as a world of plastic, a world in which we exert our will and we have all this plastic stuff and we just build the world. And we're not really part of the world. We're over the world. We are almost like little gods in the world that can force the world to be whatever it is we want. So we tell ourselves that story, but the fact is we're still in the world, right? We're still in the material world. That doesn't go away. And so the story we tell ourselves is more and more and more at odds with our physical reality about being in the world, our meaningful reality. We still move through the world. We're still bodies, embodied in the world. We're still part of it all. And so the world picture for Heidegger, this notion of science, which is really research, which creates a world of objects outside of us, leads to a notion of us controlling the world in some abstract manner. Now think about our course themes: knowledge, responsibility, society. Can you be responsible in a society that looks like that? You're at best responsible to other human beings who have wills, but you're not really responsible to the world itself. You've just turned the world into plastic, right? So, Heidegger sees this as a huge problem. We've severed ourselves, and therefore we don't really have responsibility to our world anymore. Do we know our world? No. We know correct things about the world, but that's where we stop. We don't inquire further than that. And how about responsibility, or how about society, social philosophy? Well, we just build it up as if there's nothing to be concerned with but our wills, our wants, our it's a reductionist marketplace version of reality where I just kind of put myself out there, and our actions in the marketplace create the institutions of society. Heidegger's not going to be very impressed with that at all. I mean, he's going to want to say that's a pale version of our social responsibilities to the world. It doesn't take anything into account about anything that falls outside of that marketplace notion of the world. It just doesn't. It's a pretty thin gruel, as they say. So so that's where Heidegger's coming from in all of this, and he's presenting to us a kind of reaction to some of what we saw last week with people like Comte, and for that matter, people like Mill. I mean, both Nietzsche and Heidegger are not going to have much use for someone like Mill, who wants to talk in terms of a utilitarian notion of the world. So now, so over to comments from, by Stephen in all of this. He makes some comments about metaphysics and epistemology within Heidegger, and I hope that what I've described kind of clarifies a little bit of that. The world picture, it is a kind of a packaged version of the world, not the version of the world that really is part of our human meaning. And so in that, Heidegger is picking up from Nietzsche, right? I mean, just as Nietzsche didn't want a packaged version of Jesus or a packaged version of what's, the Jew's joyful life, Heidegger doesn't want a kind of reduced ersatz packaged version of our world either. He wants the whole thing. He wants the full, and especially the thing which doesn't make us think that we are little gods. Despite what Nietzsche looks like, I mean, he looks like he's talking about the overman, and that looks like he thinks that we're little gods. Maybe in some sense, but not in the sense that would make the world into an abstract entity. We still act in the world. Remember Socrates, remember the Jews. I mean, these are the images that Nietzsche finds compelling. Goethe, Wagner, Napoleon, right? I mean, these were, except for Napoleon, who, clearly was a world conqueror, but most of these people are not world conquerors. They are people who are trying to get at the way to live life joyfully and heroically in a certain sense, but that's always within a world, within the place that you find yourself. So, so I think that's might clear up some of what Stephen has raised in some of his comments here. Heidegger is clearly much less individualistic than Nietzsche. He criticizes Nietzsche on this ground. He writes quite a lot about Nietzsche. He calls Nietzsche the last modern philosopher, and I think that's probably what he means by that. He's the last one who's looking for, some kind of grounding. Nietzsche doesn't think he's looking for a grounding, but Heidegger thinks his individualism is a kind of grounding anyway. He doesn't take into account the notion that we are in an already meaningful world, Heidegger thinks. Heidegger may be overplaying that point a little bit, but so anyway, I think Stephen gave us some good questions and good stuff to think about. Please look at his comments. Please, if you've gotten to this, you will have already obviously listened to my comments about it, and jump in. I mean, I think what we have here is yet another set of options for thinking about the relationship between our three different areas, and they're options that are not necessarily hostile to everyone that we've seen before. I mean, I think we can see, as I've already indicated or alluded, some continuity with Aristotle, certainly. And if there's a kind of hostility on the part of Nietzsche and Heidegger, it's more of a hostility to their recent forebears than their distant forebears. They seem much more exercised about what went on in the 19th century than they do what went on in the ancient times. Remember, Nietzsche was first a philologist, which meant that he was very interested in ancient texts, and Heidegger is constantly going back to the original meanings of words, constantly talking about the Greeks. In a certain sense, both of them think they are recovering a kind of aspect of what the Greeks were talking about that had been forgotten and that had been missed in modern times. So that's my kind of impression of all of this. And have at it in the discussion area. Please, I hope to see everyone kind of pitch in on that. And I would also ask that, as you're looking at that, I mean, I see that some of you have been putting in kind of your original analysis of this, and that's all great. But I also look for interaction. I also look to see, do you, can you respond to each other? Can you think about what each other is raising and things like that? The more we can make this into some sort of discussion, the better. So anyway, that's my somewhat rambling thoughts on Nietzsche and Heidegger, and I'll talk to you again soon.